Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second in our series of webinars. Today, we are very pleased to have Ollie Trussell here from Google. Ollie is a solutions engineer for Google Education, and you may have seen him at both our EduGeek conference and at various other educational events. Today, Ollie will be giving you an overview of various aspects of ChromeOS that will help existing users get more out of their devices, and will give those who are not yet using ChromeOS in education a much better overview of what it can offer you in the way of device management. Welcome, Ollie, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Sean. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Yourself?
Good, thank you. Yeah, really excited to be here today and go through an agenda with you.
Okay, well, if I hand this over to you now and you can take it from there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So hopefully everyone can see my slides on the screen. So yeah, I'm Ollie. I'm responsible for solutions engineering on the education team, covering countries all across Europe, Middle East and Africa. And based on some of your feedback, we're going to go through 4 key things today. So first off, looking at the certification options for ChromeOS and Workspace administrators. Then looking at extending and automating some of the services, actions, just general day-to-day tasks that you might be carrying out with in a school using 2 things. So one is Google Apps Script, and the second being APIs using a tool called GAM. Third, we're going to look at some power management settings for ChromeOS. So I understand that many of you have requested just some top tips around ways to reduce power consumption using ChromeOS in schools. And then finally, looking at some advanced features of Google Workspace for Education Plus using something called Drive Labels, which is a relatively new feature, and some data loss prevention rules to prevent any data that you might have being accidentally or maliciously exfiltrated or shared outside of your school. I've got an eye on the comments on the side here. So if there's any questions at any point, feel free just to ask them in the chat and I'll make sure that we respond to them regularly throughout. Likewise, if there's any other questions around anything to do with Google for Education, feel free to dump it in the chat as well, and we can try and make sure that we answer it towards the end of the presentation. But thanks for having me today. So let's begin. I'm going to start off just by talking around some of the certification options. And we know from research that actually a lot of the enterprise and education spend on cloud-based offerings is growing way faster than spending on traditional IT offerings. And this is probably more so in enterprise rather than education. And we know as a result of that, though, that many IT leaders report that the shortage of cloud computing skills will slow down many of their projects. So this is really useful for you if you're a network manager, administrator, perhaps an apprentice, just to really start thinking about the possibilities that are open to you once you start going through professional certification routes. So here at Google, we have a number of Google Cloud-based certifications and also a brand new certification route, which I'll share in a minute, called the ChromeOS Administrator. And I won't delve onto all of these individual statistics here, but essentially these open up a lot of possibilities for both you and your employer to really not only increase the functionality and the offering within your individual schools, but you as an individual just to really boost your CV as to the possible things that you can do. And actually, a lot of these Google Cloud certifications, if I go to the next slide here, are really useful, and perhaps schools wouldn't even have a clue how to think about using a professional data engineer. But we know that more and more schools are generating heaps of data through a school management system, plus all the activity on Google Workspace or other services, and having the ability to pull all of that into one central place is a really sought after skill. But the 2 things I want to focus a lot on today are these 2, what I would say more education focused certification routes. So the first one is the Professional Google Workspace Administrator certification. This used to be called the Professional Collaboration Engineer, but it's now got a bit of a rebranding, which kind of helps you understand exactly what it is. And this is focused for people who've been collaborating and working with Google Workspace as an administrator for some years. And we also have a brand new Professional ChromeOS Administrator certification. And I think probably a few of you watching might have already completed this yourselves. But it's something that was really sought after from the community, and we launched towards the end of last year. Both of these consist of a bit of multiple choice, but also some hands-on activities in a Google admin console. So it's really one of those that you can't just maybe cram for, but it does kind of require you to have some experience managing either Google Workspace or ChromeOS from an administration perspective. And we'll share these slides after. So Sean, Chris, I'll make sure that we have links that we can share out with your good folk here. But fundamentally, there's two key paths that you can work on. There's some really good kind of like how-to guides. We've got demo playlists of things that you might want to do to just really feel up to speed before you take those exams. We've got exam guides for both of these certifications. The Google Workspace Administrator one has these sample questions that you can take, and then when you're ready, you can go through and actually take these certifications. Now, both of these typically have a $200 certification cost. There are some discounts available in the Google Workspace Administrator if you're doing many of these in an organization, perhaps it's a multi-academy trust. But what you should really capitalize on is right now, the Professional ChromeOS Administrator certification is completely free of charge. So we're waiving the cost of that. So it's a no-brainer, really. If you are working in a school or an academy trust that has ChromeOS, I'd strongly recommend you getting involved and just going through the process to get this certification, because it will really help both you and I think your schools that you work with to really make sure you're taking the full value of ChromeOS and what it has to offer. So if there's any questions around any of the certification, feel free to track them in the chat here, and I'll make sure I follow up at some point today as well. So moving on, so we're going to have a look at kind of extending and automating some of the things you do with Google Workspace and Chrome using both AppScript and APIs. So this session is going to be a bit of a mix between kind of a few slides, but then also some hands-on demos showcasing some of this in action. So to start with, AppScript, some of you may never have heard of, but it's a JavaScript-based language. It's integrated really, really tightly with a number of kind of Google Workspace services, which I'll showcase in a minute. And what's really useful is it's the basis for a number of really great kind of third-party tools, marketplace add-ons, which you may have been using, are all built on AppScript. There's some really, really great resources and scripts out there through Stack Overflow, EduGeek forums, for example, and it just allows you to really enhance what's possible within Google Workspace. And to think about it, if you're coming from a Microsoft-based world, obviously Google Workspace has very good similarities with Office. Sheets and Excel are really close. And then if you're familiar with VB macros, basically Google AppScript has a very similar base language, and it's actually now possible to convert any macros that you had in the Microsoft world into Google AppScript. So we have a macros converter add-on. So if you've got some really great projects that are built in Microsoft Excel files, you should be able to pretty easily convert those up to Google Sheets if that's been a blocker for you in the past. And as I mentioned before, these are just a handful of some of the Google services that can be automated. You can use AppScript to make these things talk to each other and do some really clever, cool stuff. And we've got reference guides for all of these. And what I really love about some of our developer documentation is there's just something called a Try It Explorer. So you can actually just go through and without having to set up a whole project and configuring this, you can just interact with some of our APIs and authenticate as an admin or an end user to see what they might do to give you a bit of flavor of what's happening. We've also got some really great kind of just step-by-step guides. Plus today, I'm going to give you a takeaway with lots of kind of snippets in that you can just go through and get started on your AppScript journey if you haven't yet. So just a few additional concepts. So beyond just the concept of a Google AppScript, we've got something called add-ons. So add-ons are something that you could design yourself, but we've also got a really good marketplace community with some of the most used kind of education apps out there, like Pear Deck, for example, Nearpod, all have add-ons that integrate directly with Workspace. We've now got a concept of Google Classroom add-ons, so we see more and more developers like Kahoot, for example, really closely integrating with Google Classroom, and it's all through AppScript. And then what I really love is you have the ability to create a pretty simple web app. So if you want to build a front end, and we'll look at a few examples later, it's really easy to build and host that from within a bound Google AppScript project for no cost, which is really, really great. So for lightweight applications, it's a really great opportunity for you as a school to get playing around with and enhancing the workspace integrations. So there's a load of different use cases. I obviously don't have too long with you today, but these are some of the things that you can do to kind of really support some of the services that might happen within your school. So automation is key, reporting out, domain management. So actually managing your users, your Chrome devices, all through AppScript automatically is a really, really powerful tool. So let's delve in. So we've got a few different types of script, and I'll go and show these in a moment. So one of the most useful thing is you can actually have an app script project bound to a drive file. So whether that's a doc, sheet, slide, or form. So this is very similar to some of the macros you might be familiar with Microsoft Excel, for example. And this is really useful because it allows you to do clever things like you can detect whether a cell is active or not. You can make something execute every time the spreadsheet is edited or a particular range is edited or updated. You can get things to automate as soon as a Google form is submitted, which is a really powerful tool. And I can talk about some of those in a bit detail and show you some examples. But it allows you to really enhance and automate many things here. And on top of that, you've got basically something called standalone scripts. So this is a script that's not bound to a given Google Drive resource. And you can access them at script.google.com. And they're really useful for things like web apps, developing add-ons, and all these other options that you can go through and configure here. Now, the developer environment, if you're familiar with JavaScript, looks like a pretty standard IDE. It's got some really great autocomplete options, auto formatting, and within one place you can configure all of your code, all the services, any libraries, and you can configure triggers, and you get some really nice kind of logging, etc., all within one standalone platform, which is pretty nice. So we're going to have a look at a few examples and get hands-on. So over here, I've got a Google Sheet file that we're going to use, and you can actually get access to everything that I'm doing today and follow along with the video afterwards. But we're going to start off by looking at something called custom functions. So I'm going to create a very simple one here that's just called toCelsius, and I'll go through and basically show you how you can write your own functions and you can use them in a spreadsheet to do something that isn't there. So if you want to do something that's beyond the standard set of functions like sum, max, countif, for example, you can actually go through and create your own functions. Side note, I actually used one of these when I was planning my wedding, and I created a custom function that calculated almost to a perfect T exactly how much beer and wine we needed to order. So it's one of my non-career highlights. My wife was less impressed, but happy to share that with you later if anyone needs. But talking about the option of bound scripts, so in the extensions option here, you'll see I can go through and click on app script. And this is really nice because it allows me to really tightly integrate with the spreadsheet that I've come from here. And I've got a number of different files that I'll be working through today on the left. And this is a very simple function that I've just created called toCelsius, and it reads the input. So in this case, I'm going to input a cell reference. And then what it will do is it will perform a calculation and return that back to the cell. So if I go back to my spreadsheet here, and if I want to just convert this Fahrenheit into Celsius, I could just type in equals. And then you'll see that normally I've got all of these standard spreadsheet functions here, but within this list, because it's bound to the app script on the back, I've now got this toCelsius option, and I can reference a cell and press enter, and it will just go through, perform the calculation and return that to the sheet. And it works in the same way I'd expect any kind of other cell to use. So I can drag and drop that down, and then a really easy way to go through here. Now, this is a pretty rubbish example, but you'll see what you can actually go through and do this. So beyond just inputs, you can actually take the cell, you can work out what the color of that cell was, right? And you could perform certain calculations, whether a cell color was green, yellow, and red, and do some pretty complex tasks quite nicely just from building your own custom functions here. So this is a step-by-step guide. So after this session, we'll give you both this slide presentation, but also the Google Sheet that I'm working on with all those bound scripts. So don't feel the need to take notes, but you can definitely play around with this at your leisure after this webinar. So this gives you an idea about what you need to go through and do. So I would copy some function, add it to the script, and then I'll be able to use and reference that in the spreadsheet as I just showed. Another really powerful use of AppScript is the ability to send emails, either on like a mass mail merge or through an automation process using something like a form submit trigger or an hourly or a daily trigger. So how this works is I can go through, I'm going to give an example here. I want to go through, take a mail address and a message and automate bulk sending a load of emails from here. So I can see I could build a spreadsheet that has a load of email addresses. I could have some messages. I could add more fields if I want. I can customize those, make them bespoke, do whatever I need to. But this is a very simple example of using a sample script that will go through and run this. So I'm going to go through and showcase what this looks like in practice. So if I go through onto my sheet, you'll see I've got a sheet called emails here. I've got a few emails with some messages. If I jump into my app script examples, you'll see I've got this option to send emails. And I'll just very quickly talk through what this code does. So firstly, I go through and take the sheet that I want. So in this case, it's referenced to a sheet that's called emails. I will then go through, get the starting row, choose how many rows I want to process. So if I decide actually I want to process more than just one row, I could change this to the entire data set. And then it's going to go through, and for every row that I have in here, it's going to take the email address, the message, it's going to add a subject, and it's going to go ahead and send that email. So I can go through and run this. The first time that you run any script that requires access to any of the Google services like Mail, Drive, for example, you have to go through and review the permissions. And I can go through, and you can't see what I'm doing here, but I'm just basically going through the standard OAuth process and accepting those. And that's going to go through and send some emails on the back end here. So I can go through, and if I very quickly just check my emails in a moment, you'll see that that has gone through, sent an email to Daffy Duck saying, hey, how are you? So I'm in a Daffy email over here, and it's just gone through and processed all those. So think about how you might use this in a school. So if you want to send an email out to 200 parents, for example, you can customize and personalize that from a spreadsheet. You can do automation. So as soon as somebody submits a Google form, you can send an email off to that person or another relevant individual, and all those can be automatically triggered. So it's a really nice way to automate a communications flow in your school. So that was simply using the mail app flow to go ahead and send emails. And then another really great thing is you can actually go through and create custom menus into your docs, your sheets, slides, forms, whatever you might need to do. So you'll see over here, you can actually go through and add in an additional column up here. So if I go back to my spreadsheet, you'll see in my menus bar, I've added this additional one. So normally the menus ends at help, but I've added an additional one called admin menu. And then I've got a number of additional functions that I can go through and add on here. So these are pretty easy to go through and configure. The sample code is basically, it's an on-open event. So what this is a trigger that will run this function every time that that spreadsheet or doc or slide is opened. It will go and execute this. And basically it's going through and adding a number of entries and creating a custom menu. So if I go through to my custom menu slide, you'll see I've got the same on-open event. It's getting the spreadsheet, and then I've got 3 different entries all on here, and it's adding those to the menu. And this is really useful if you want to create some automation or some additional integration between other services, but you don't want your users to have to go through, open up the app script project, find the relevant function and run it. Using a custom menu makes it really easy for end users to go through and execute some of the custom app script that you've built. So I've got 3 different functions here, and I'll talk about those in a moment as to how they operate. But that's a really nice additional feature to use a custom menu. And then what I really love to do is I can actually combine this. So if you are a workspace administrator in your school, you can actually go through and add in some really deep integration with your admin console. So we have something called the Admin SDK Directory Service. And this is what's called an advanced Google service. So you'll see over here, I've got these services, and I've already added the admin directory. So these are services beyond just a standard Drive app, spreadsheet app, for example, that you have to explicitly add because they're not really going to be available to all users to go through and add in just every app script project. So in here, there's loads of really good stuff like an advanced Drive API, a license manager API. Perhaps you've got some Education Plus licenses that you want to automate the distribution of, or Google Classroom or some tight Google Calendar API. You can go through and add these services really easily on here. So if I add the Classroom API, you'll see that I can now, in a moment, integrate with the Google Classroom service over here. So that's how you add a service, and then there's loads of really clever things you can do. So I've got a few examples here on like how to create users. So perhaps you want a simple spreadsheet for your staff to fill in, and every time they fill in a new row, it will create a new user if you're not doing some automated onboarding. Or perhaps you want someone who manages the staff who come in to do cover, and perhaps when they come in, you want somebody other than an admin to go through and fill out a row on a spreadsheet, press a button, and it would automatically generate a cover supervisor staff account. Really lots of clever things that you can go through and configure here. So these are some sample codes that you can go through and configure. But I'm going to go through and show you some samples I have on here. So this first one is something called list users, and it's going to go through and list all the users in my domain. So you can go ahead and use this function here. I've got another one to go through and list all the Google groups in my domain, and I've got another one to list all the devices in my domain here. So you'll see that these functions, I can actually choose to run this function directly from the app script project here. And it helps if I go through and let's just remove this because I don't need to do that. And sorry, 1 minute. I'll update this before I send it to you all. Don't worry. It's good when something goes wrong in a live demo, isn't it? So let me go through here and try this now. So this is going to go through, it's going to list all the users in my domain. And it's going to go through and get the username, primary email, and then it's going to log all of those on a sheet called users. So I've got a little logger running in here, but if I jump back to my script now and head to my users, you'll see I've got a list of all the users in my domain with a custom external ID if I needed to here as well. And likewise, I could do the same from over here. So I can either run this groups function. So let me just update that on here as well. And you'll see that I have the option to either run this as I did before directly from here, or I can actually go back and use my custom menu over here. So in the admin menu, I could choose to list all my groups. And then as soon as that script is finished executing, it's going to add all of my groups directly onto here. And likewise for devices, if I want to do, I could go through and in the admin menu, list all my devices. It's going to take all of my Chrome devices across my tenant and chuck all those on a sheet for me. And I can see just some standard information like serial number, who the recent users were, whether that's active, the model number, etc. So really, really useful option to have on you here as well. So you can obviously extend this and make this as lightweight or as heavy duty as you want. I know entire schools or multi-academy trusts who are running a lot of their user and group management directly from a spreadsheet themselves. So hopefully this is going to be useful for you. I will make sure I update the back end before I share the link a bit later in the show. Cool. So that's the overall element here. What I really love is this additional feature where you can actually use Google Apps Script to create web apps. So I'm going to go through and show you an example here. So let's imagine I want to make just a really simple web app, and maybe I won't share it with you in the comments today, but just to, this example is going to give you a button to press if you think it's a great talk, and another button if you think it needs improvement. So I'll go through and showcase how this works. Essentially what you have is you can do any kind of standard HTML, and within the Google Apps Script project, you can either add individual script files or you can add these HTML pages. So if you're familiar with HTML editing, this is just a standard HTML page, super simple. It's just got some 2 input buttons. And then the most important thing is you can actually call from this HTML functions that exist on the relevant Apps Script project. So you'll see here that when I click the Great Talk button, it's going to call a function called Good Feedback. And if I tick the needs improvement option, it's going to call a function called bad feedback. Now, both of these functions live on this same bound app script, and they could live anywhere in this project that I want. So a few things are going to happen here. So when good feedback is clicked, it's going to send an email, and then it's also going to log onto a spreadsheet some web app feedback. So if they click good, it's going to say good. If they click bad, it's going to say bad. And I think I might have tested this before, so let me just go through. No, so you'll see right now that this sheet is completely empty. So pretty easy to go through and set up. The most important part is this do get function. And I'll showcase how to publish this, but this basically what happens is when a web app endpoint is called to this script, you choose what to return. So in this case, I'm choosing to return the web.html file. So I'll go through and showcase how to actually go through and publish this. So right now, there's no way of me accessing this web app. The first thing I need to do is actually go through and choose to deploy this. So I can click on a new deployment up here, and I can choose web app in this case, but there's a number of different things that you can go through. If you ever want to publish your own add-on, you can also do it through this menu here. I can give this a simple description. So let's call this V1. And this is really useful. So you can choose to either execute this as yourself, or if you want to find out like who the actual user accessing the web app was, you could choose the user accessing the web app, and they would need to authenticate in the same way they would to any other kind of third-party Google service. But for this, I'm just going to execute this as myself. And actually, I want anyone to be able to access this simple web app and give me feedback. So instead of just restricting this to myself or people within my school, I can actually choose to make this available to anybody and completely unauthenticated. So I've got no idea who's accessing this web app. And that's fine for this case. So within just a few moments, that's it. I'm ready to go. And I've now got this web app that's deployed. The URL for it is here. I could chuck that into a short link if I want. I could push this out through bookmarks, but you'll see it's just got a very simple web app with 2 buttons. I haven't done any kind of like disabling or JavaScript element, but I'll showcase what happens here. So if I tick Great Talk, for example, what happens is the app script function on the back end will be triggered. So this good feedback. And you'll see that on my web app feedback, I've got a timestamp being placed and good. And if I jump back to the web app and tick needs improvement, that's going to update my spreadsheet with bad. And if I really think this is terrible, I can tick that a few times, and it's going to add a function for every time I add that on there as well. And it's actually also going to go through and send some feedback via email to Daffy, because that was also triggered in here as well. So lots of different things you can go through and configure here. I would recommend that web apps are great for kind of like in school or in Academy Trust projects. John, you've asked what are the free/included limits for web apps. It's not particularly well documented, but you will run into some delays in accessing if you get to the concurrent user numbers in the thousands. So it's a really great question, John. Typically, for most use cases, for any kind of web app in a school, you should be absolutely fine just with the free web app version. If you're building a proper project that you're going to externalize, we'd recommend using something different, like Firebase hosting might be a better option. But for simple projects like this, a web app's a really nice, easy way to get started. Cool, great question. And then just moving on to a few other things. So what we talked about now is these kind of app script functions that you can go through and press buttons to run. You can add custom menus, lots of cool stuff. But actually what you might want is things to automatically happening. So you set it up and leave it, just knowing that this really great workflow is happening in the background. And you can do that using something called triggers. So if I jump back to my app script project, you'll see that I have this option over here called triggers. And you can add a trigger for any of these functions here. So I can add a trigger. I can choose which function I want to run. So maybe I want to run this send emails option, and I can choose to make that run perhaps time driven. So I can make that run, maybe if I want to really annoy my colleagues, I can choose that to run every minute for the rest of the time, and every minute it's going to send an automatic email. I strongly advocate you don't do this. Number one, you might be flagged for abuse of our system, but number two, you're going to really annoy your colleagues. But there's lots of different options you can do here. From a spreadsheet, it's really useful, because then you can get some functions that run every time something is edited or changed. You might want to get a notification, but this form submit option is a really powerful tool. And I'll showcase that in a minute when we look to a slightly different example using Google Chat. So I haven't set up any triggers right now, because the final thing that I want to show you is just some really good examples. And actually, it was a friend of mine, Luke Craig, who teaches at Britannia Village School in East London, who came up with a really good idea to use chat messages and webhooks to kind of give teachers in their chat spaces, so they're a Google using school, have been for many years, a bit of really nice integration between chat and maybe Google Forms. So I'm going to go through and showcase how this works. So we've got this concept called webhooks in Google Chat. And if you're unfamiliar with that, let me just jump into Google Chat to showcase how this works. So you'll see I've got a couple of spaces here. I've got one down here for year 2 and one down here for year 1. If you click on a space and if you go to the drop down, you have this option to manage webhooks. And this is really useful because you can go through and do a few things. So let me just showcase how I've done this in year 2. So in year 2, I can click manage webhooks, and I've got, let me just copy this documentation. So I'm going to go through and take this URL here and showcase how this works. You can add multiple webhooks into a chat space. So where I go to manage webhooks, I'm going to create something here called student notifications. And you have to give it a 128 pixel URL. So what this does is it adds the ability for me using this webhook to post automatically or whenever I want into this chat space. So I can simply go through and copy this webhook. If I head back to my app script, you'll see I've got a few functions here ready to go, and I'm actually going to update the year 1 webhook with that one that I just created and copied there. So I basically get a chat.googleapis.com and then a really unique key here that's specific to that space. Then what I'm going to do is I've got these messages. So let's imagine in school, if you teach in a primary school, I get messages all the time from my kids' teachers that one of my daughters has bumped their heads or grazed their knee or whatever. And it might be really useful to just have a student notification system that automates this process because someone's going to fill it in and let the teachers of year 1 or year 2 know, for example. So what this does is it takes a message, it says hello, it says the child name, the first aider name, the injury, description, and injury action, and it then posts it into that chat space. So I'll showcase how this works. If I just go through and show you a test example, and I choose my daughter, Ida, and I'm going to go through and run this function, test chat, and press run. What's going to happen is it's going to post a message from there into the year 2 chat space. So you'll see that I've now got a new message in year 2 and all that information about Ida, the first aider, bumped their head, has gone into that chat space there. So pretty useful, and it's quite cool that you can automate that and send that directly from on here. But actually what I've got is I've got this send chat on form submit task. So what I might want to do is when my first aiders fill out that form to say that my daughter's grazed her knee and they had a plaster put to it, you can then alert a parent, but also alert a chat space for all the teachers of year 2, for example. So if I go and showcase how this works in practice, before I actually go and fill out the form, what I want to do is I want to make this execute every time the form's submitted. So in the trigger section, I can go through, choose that function, send chat on form submit, and I want that to run every time the form is submitted. And I just need to authenticate that again because it's going to run in the background while I'm not here. So that is now done. I have a trigger that's been created. So if I go back to my Google form, and let's imagine I want to fill out this live form now. So imagine I'm a first aider. I found a kid who has cut their leg and perhaps they've got a plaster, and I could just put her on playground, and I'm going to go through and submit that form. So what's happening, if you're familiar with Google Forms already, which hopefully you are, you'll see that that's filled out this Google Sheet here, but then what's happened because of that app script function is it's automatically sent that to a chat space. So if I go back to my year 1 project over here, my year 1 chat space, and you'll see before this was empty, but because I filled out that form, I've set up the webhook and the app script, it's automatically sent that information through to the chat space. And as I said before, I could have automated that process. If I had a list of student names and their parents' emails, that could have all been handily automated in the back end for me. So some really, really powerful things that you can go through and configure, particularly using triggers. And there's a number of other bits of sample code you can get. So if you want an automated weather report, you can go through and configure that here. There's a really cool thing called the language APIs. It's called natural language processing. And I love playing around with this. There's a bit more work to do here, but you can actually go through and actually, if you've got a feedback form from parents, for example, you can detect what the sentiment was, whether they were positive or negative, and maybe just only read the positive or the negative ones, entirely up to you. So some really clever things that you can go through and configure and automatically color code accordingly. And then macros, you can actually go through and also record macros. So if you're familiar with what you might be doing in Excel, for example, you can go through record a process, import processes, and run those again in the future, which might make your life much easier. And then so from additional, I think it was John who asked a question around quota. There is some standard quota. As I said, there's not too much documented around web apps, and then typically what you'll just see is increased latency. But there are some kind of hard facts here, and apologies, this is a dated table, so I need to update this. But emails are important. So you can send about 1,500. I think that limit is now increased to 2,000 per day from an API. Cool. I think before I kind of move on to the third part then, and it's worth noting, by the way, that we have all of this available, and when you click on this link when you get it, so bit.ly/appscript examples, you'll have all that information and you can copy there. Please hold tight on that before I send that off. Actually, I'll tell you what, I might quickly do it now and update those two URLs. But one thing that I would recommend, if you haven't already, is every Google Workspace for Education customer is entitled to an education test domain. And so we have some guides on how to do that. So for example, if my domain was called bestschool.com, I could sign up for a brand new Google for Education tenant called gworkspacetest.bestschool.com. And it's really, really useful. So it allows you to have this full sandbox environment where you can play around with this without worrying about accidentally deleting all of your users, for example. So if you haven't done that already, I would strongly recommend going and doing this. While I'm on the call here, I will quickly jump into there. And I think there was a question from Alex E. If you could bring that up, Chris or Sean, I'll make sure I get to answering that. So we've got some weird differences. Let me just go through and add that in here. And then I'll come back to your question. Apologies. Cool. So do feel free now to make a copy of that AppScript examples. I've noticed some weird differences between the front end and running an AppScript. For example, if you change ownership of a drive file in the front end, it appears in the user's My Drive, but in the AppScript, it doesn't. Change ownership of a drive file in the front end. Interesting. No, Alex, it's probably not. And I would recommend if that does happen again, raise a support ticket. If you work with a Google for Education partner, let them know and they can escalate that. But no, typically the ownership of the file. Maybe if you, I'll follow up afterwards, Alex. I'll give you my email and we can talk in that a bit more detail. But maybe I misunderstand the question a bit. But no, typically it should work as you'd expect. So thanks, Sean and Chris, for posting that link. But yeah, feel free to play around with that on your own domain, but maybe get a sandbox domain first. Cool. And then finally, just looking at GAM. So many of you will have used GAM before. It's a really great tool that allows you to basically do everything with the APIs that you would, but it's in a really nice command line interface. So if you're familiar with Python, you can write your own Python scripts and just execute those. There's a few it's really extensively used. It was actually initially published by a Googler called Jay Lee. There is an advanced version, which adds just a bit more extra functionality, but is run off the same fork. So I'd strongly recommend kind of using that. You can do a heap of stuff on here as well. There's a number of trusts across the UK who automate their entire Google Workspace population cycle of users, deprovisioning, licenses, Chrome devices, all using GAM, and you can run it by scheduled tasks, whatever you need to. You can execute programs whenever you need to. So it's a really powerful tool. Bulk actions is the most useful. You're limited somewhat by making bulk actions via UI in the admin console, but typically you can do almost everything in GAM. So I'm not going to delve into it too much. One thing I would recommend, if you haven't already used it, is actually there's something called the Google Cloud Console Cloud Shell, which is really useful. So you can actually set up GAM in a Cloud Shell for free and just run standard commands. So if I want to do something like GAM info domain, this will give me all the information about my domain in my command line. And I could do something like GAM print cross all fields to drive. And what that's going to do is it's going to go through and basically get all of the devices that I have in my domain, all the information, all the possible attributes, so CPU, battery health, for example, that I might have. And because I finished it with ToDrive, it's going to put all those in a spreadsheet. And I can just go and open that in Drive. And 704 devices, probably would have taken me a bit while to go through and manually do. But if I go ahead and open that, you'll see I've now got all of the devices in my tenant and a heap of information about it, like the CPU quality, battery health, charge, volume currently on the device, probably more information than you'd ever need. But there's some really powerful things that you can go through and do here. There's something called a GAM cheat sheet, but there's this really great site that's been put together for GAM Advanced that just goes through some pretty cool things to do. So if you want to do like mass deletion of Google Drive or mass migration or moving of Drive files within your tenant. There's some really clever stuff that you can go through and do here, and there's some bulk commands that you can just go through and start using. So if you haven't gone through and played around with GAM yet, please do. There's some really good stuff for you to play around with here. And yeah, strongly recommend having a look. And then power management for ChromeOS settings. So moving on from GAM and AppScript, conscious of time here. If you haven't already, we know that kind of actually power consumption is a huge huge demand and burden on schools at the minute. But if you haven't already, please go ahead and search in the user and browser settings for power and device settings. And you can do simple things like just configure the idle time screen settings. There's a few things that we're working on in the future for updates, which will trigger a gentle awake for every few seconds whilst devices are on charge. So in the near future, you'll be able to kind of like programmatically update in a trolley overnight, which will be really useful, and set kind of update windows between those, because we know typically power's a bit cheaper on off-peak hours. So perhaps if you've got thousands of devices that all need to just download an update, instead of maybe doing that during lesson time and staying on when they need to, you could trigger that to happen overnight, for example. But there's some really good things for you to play around with on there as well. I'm not going to spend too long going through the console, but please just go through and search in both the user and device settings for power, and seeing if any of those might be able to support your school. And then finally, we've got something called drive labels and DLP rules. So drive labels are a relatively new feature that have come to the admin console. If you have Workspace for Education Plus, you can go through and configure these in the access and data controls section. We've got data classification. And this is where you can go through, configure your drive and docs labels. So I've got a few here. The file sensitivity is a really useful one, particularly as we hear so often about kind of files being accidentally leaked. So I've got one in this domain here where I basically require users to decide whether a file is restricted or confidential or can be made public. And you could assign this and force users to apply this to their files. And how this works in practice is if I go through and just give a quick example. So maybe I want to create a new Google Doc. And perhaps I want to go through and call this a newsletter. And I could say something like, "Dear parents," but you'll see that straight away I've been prompted to fill in missing fields for a label. So I can go through, tick in here, and I'm going to say this is going to be public. And in fact, I might at the very beginning of this go through and choose to make this file available to anyone with a link. Cool. So let's go through and say, yada, 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 please email otrussell@google.com if you have any questions. You get the idea. So I've got a newsletter that I'm ready to send, and I've chosen to make this public. But let's go back a stage and maybe think about, maybe I don't want users sharing emails, or perhaps if I've got something that contains passport numbers or some health information, I might not want my users to go through and make that public. So I can actually go through and there's these data protection rules that are available. Now, data protection is available to all editions, but if you want to interact with labels, it requires Education Plus. And you'll see I've got a couple of rules available here. So I'm going to show two things that you can go through and configure. So the first thing I'm going to do is I've got this rule, which I've called apply sensitivity if email is detected. And I can choose to apply this to everybody or just an organization unit. I can choose to apply it to Google Chat or Google Drive. So Google Chat's a really great one. If you're worried about enabling Google Chat because you're afraid students might send naughty messages to each other, you can actually configure some DLP rules that picks that up or blocks them sending words from a regex or a word list, for example, that contains some not so nice terms, for example. So some really clever things you can do to protect your users from bullying, for example, intra-domain. But I'm actually concerned about files being shared externally here. So I'm going to apply a Google Drive rule. I'm actually going to try and match a predefined data type And in this case, I'm just going to choose email address, but it could be something like a passport number. It could be time. In UK, I think we've got a few on here. So maybe passport number, national insurance number. Maybe I don't want any documents being shared externally if they contain somebody's NHS number, for example. I can go through and press continue. And in this case, I'm going to choose to apply a drive label and call it restricted. So to showcase the user that this is a restricted file because something exists within that. I could get an automatic notification when that happens if I want. I could review it, update it, make it active when I'm ready. And then what's really nice is I can actually take that further. So I'm going to actually choose another one here that prevents sharing sensitive content. So in this case, any file that's got a restricted label on it, I'm going to go through and choose to completely block that being shared externally, which is really, really nice. If I want, I could warn external sharing to let the user know that, hey, it contains sensitive content, or I could allow it to be shared externally, but that file couldn't be downloaded or copy and pasted from. So pretty simple to go through and configure these rules. We've got some really nice support articles for how to go through and configure that. But if I go back to my file here, you'll see that just whilst I've been talking, that's been updated because it's detected the email. I've now got a badge saying it's restricted because it contains PII information. And if I click on my share option here, you'll see that this now does not allow me to share this externally, and that's been explicitly blocked. So some really, really powerful tools that you can go through and configure. If you haven't got any DLP rules configured, please go and play with that now, because it's really useful for keeping your data safe. And if you've got Education Plus, drive labels are a really nice way to add that additional metadata to end users. So when we share this out later, there is a Google video, YouTube video that goes through me running a very similar demo if you want to recap that. Cool, and that's it. So we have these slides are available. So if you want to, maybe Sean, Chris, you could chuck that link in the chat, so you can review these at your own pleasure later. Share them with colleagues, whatever you need to, and please post any further questions, as the team is saying, in the chat here. I think we had a question from Ditto. Let's see if we got that here. Do you test workspaces for charities? I'm ex-school, but now with a charity that works with a number of schools, so benefit from a similar arrangement. Cool. So if they're a charity, it's likely a non-profit organization. So we offer Google for non-profits, and in which case for Google non-profits, it's completely free. You can get within there, you can use Google Classroom and all these other elements, but I will make sure just Google for non-profits and start that process here. And if you did want some of the more advanced, like enterprise grade capabilities, there's significant discounts for non-profit organizations on those as well. So at least kind of 70% discounts on some of the enterprise editions, should you wish to go through there as well. Great question.
Ollie, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to see you again on EduGeek in the future.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to joining you in the future. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.